October 1944, northwestern France. Smoke drifted across the battlefield where the remnants of the German 352nd Infantry Division had finally laid down their arms. Obergefreiter Klaus Weber crouched behind the rubble of what had once been a farmhouse, his rifle trembling in his hands. Around him, his comrades emerged from their positions with white flags improvised from torn undershirts and bandages. The sound of approaching boots grew louder. British soldiers appeared through the haze, their uniforms remarkably clean despite weeks of combat. Weber had expected shouting, perhaps immediate violence. Instead, the British troops moved with methodical precision, their faces masks of professional discipline. A British sergeant approached Weber's position, his rifle lowered but ready. The man's eyes were steady, neither cruel nor kind, simply matter-of-fact. He spoke in accented but comprehensible German. Weapons down, hands visible. You will be searched and processed according to military procedure. Weber dropped his rifle, the metal clattering against stone. His heart hammered against his ribs as Nazi propaganda flooded his mind. The broadcasts from Berlin had been explicit. British Empire, built on colonial brutality, would show no mercy to German prisoners. Expect beatings, starvation, forced labor unto death. Better to die fighting than face what the British would do to captured soldiers. Yet as Weber raised his hands, no blow came. The British soldier conducted a thorough but professional search, confiscating ammunition and personal weapons while allowing Weber to retain his identification papers and a photograph of his wife. When the search revealed a small wound on Weber's arm, the soldier called for a medic without hesitation. The British medic, a young man with gentle hands, cleaned and bandaged the wound with the same care he might show a British soldier. Weber stared in confusion as the medic worked, applying sulfa powder and fresh gauze. This contradiction between expectation and reality created a cognitive dissonance that would define the next 18 months of his life. 200 German prisoners shuffled into formation under British supervision. Weber noticed the guards' behavior. No unnecessary shouting, no gratuitous displays of power. Orders were given clearly in German by British personnel who had learned the language specifically for this purpose. The efficiency was impressive and slightly unsettling. Britain had clearly anticipated holding large numbers of German prisoners and prepared accordingly. The first meal as prisoners provided another shock. Weber had expected starvation rations, the deliberate cruelty promised by propaganda. Instead, British soldiers distributed bread, stew with actual meat, tea, and margarine. More food than Weber's unit had received during the final weeks of fighting in Normandy. He ate slowly, suspiciously, waiting for some cruel revelation that this was temporary kindness before real brutality began. During the 3-day transport across the Channel and through the English countryside, Weber observed his captors carefully. British guards maintained professional distance without descending into cruelty. Wounded prisoners received medical attention. Adequate food continued. The landscape outside the train windows showed lush green fields and undamaged villages, a stark contrast to the war-ravaged territories Weber had known for months. The propaganda had prepared Weber for everything except this: systematic, professional treatment that acknowledged prisoners as human beings rather than animals to be abused. Each contradiction forced him to question what else Berlin had lied about. If British treatment of prisoners was false, what about the racial theories? The claims about Jewish conspiracy? The entire ideological foundation of the regime he had fought for? Camp 174 in Lancashire appeared through morning mist as their transport arrived. The facility sprawled across several acres, wooden barracks surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers. Despite the imposing perimeter, the atmosphere within seemed unexpectedly calm. No screaming guards, no evidence of systematic brutality, just the quiet efficiency that characterized everything British. Processing began immediately. Personal information recorded, medical examinations conducted, camp rules explained in German by British officers who maintained professional demeanor throughout. Weber was assigned to a barrack shared with other soldiers from his division. The accommodations, though Spartan, were clean and weatherproof. Each prisoner received a cot, blanket, and basic toiletries. The barracks were heated against autumn's chill. Captain Robert Ashford commanded Camp 174 with a philosophy that would reshape Weber's understanding of civilization itself. Ashford, a veteran of North Africa and Italy, operated under clear directives that emphasized maintaining discipline without descending into cruelty. His approach reflected deeply held British military and cultural values about proper conduct, even in war. The camp rules were posted in German and explained clearly. Work assignments mandatory unless medically excused. Cooperation required. Defiance punished. Escape attempts prevented. Medical care provided to all. Religious services permitted. Letter writing allowed under censorship. No fraternization with guards. Discipline maintained through orderly procedures. The rules weren't kind, but they were fair, applied equally without favoritism or arbitrary cruelty. British military philosophy regarding prisoner treatment had evolved through centuries of warfare and colonial administration. The approach emphasized that maintaining civilized standards served multiple strategic purposes: security, intelligence gathering, diplomatic considerations, and moral authority. Well-treated prisoners caused fewer problems than abused ones. Cooperative prisoners provided valuable information voluntarily. Proper treatment ensured reciprocal treatment of British POWs in German camps. Most importantly, Britain was fighting for civilization, which meant maintaining civilized standards even toward enemies. The system of British POW camps operated under clear directives that balanced security with fundamental respect for prisoners as human beings. By 1944, Britain held over 400,000 German and Italian prisoners in camps scattered across England, Scotland, and Wales. The system operated under Geneva Convention guidelines. Prisoners would be treated according to international law, worked within legal parameters, fed adequately, housed properly, and disciplined firmly but fairly. This wasn't sentiment. It was calculated policy with multiple objectives. Security considerations demanded that well-treated prisoners caused fewer problems than abused ones. Intelligence requirements meant cooperative prisoners provided valuable information. Diplomatic necessity ensured proper treatment, guaranteed reciprocal treatment of British POWs in German camps. Moral authority required that Britain, fighting for civilization, maintain civilized standards even toward enemies. The British philosophy toward guarding German prisoners reflected deeply held military and cultural values about proper conduct, even in war. British guards, many veterans of North Africa, Italy, or France, operated under clear directives that emphasized maintaining discipline without descending into cruelty. The cultural expectation was restraint. You demonstrated superiority not through brutality but through unshakable composure and adherence to standards. Sergeant Major William Thompson, who supervised guards at Camp 174, articulated this philosophy. These men were our enemies. They fought for Hitler, killed our mates, bombed our cities, but they're prisoners now, which means they're our responsibility. We don't abuse them because we're not savages. We maintain order through discipline and fairness. That's the British way. We don't need to beat men to show we've beaten them. The barbed wire does that. This restrained approach created distinctive camp atmospheres. Guards didn't fraternize with prisoners, but showed professional courtesy. Orders were given clearly and enforced consistently. Violations of rules resulted in disciplinary action, typically confinement or reduced privileges, but not physical abuse. The contrast with Nazi treatment of prisoners was absolute and intentional. Britain was demonstrating that democratic civilization could maintain moral standards even under war's pressures, and a pointed refutation of Nazi claims that democracies were weak and decadent. The efficiency and humanity of British POW administration served as practical demonstration that civilized values weren't weakness, but foundation of lasting strength. 3 days after Weber's arrival, an incident occurred that would crystallize everything he was learning about British character. Prisoners had been assembled for individual interrogation sessions, standard procedure for gathering intelligence about German military capabilities and morale. Weber stood in line with dozens of other prisoners, expecting the harsh questioning techniques propaganda had described. The interrogation facility was a converted barrack with tables, chairs, and filing cabinets, where British intelligence officers conducted systematic debriefing of prisoners. Weber had heard stories from other camps about brutal interrogation methods, psychological torture, and physical coercion designed to break prisoners' resistance and extract military secrets. Captain Ashford entered the interrogation area, but instead of beginning immediate questioning, he surveyed the assembled prisoners with calm assessment. The prisoners tensed, expecting orders to strip, submit to searches, or endure the beginning of systematic abuse. Instead, Captain Ashford spoke words that would echo in Weber's memory for the rest of his life. "Time for tea, gentlemen." The prisoners exchanged confused glances. Several British soldiers wheeled in a proper tea service. China cups, saucers, a large teapot, milk, sugar, and biscuits arranged on white tablecloths. The formality was surreal in the context of military interrogation. Weber wondered if this was some elaborate psychological torture, a cruel joke before real brutality began. Captain Ashford personally served tea to each prisoner, maintaining the same courteous demeanor he might show to visiting dignitaries. The china clinked softly as he poured, steam rising from the cups in the cool air. He offered milk and sugar with genuine politeness, asking preferences as if hosting a social gathering rather than questioning enemy soldiers. Weber accepted his cup with trembling hands, still expecting some violent revelation. The tea was hot, properly brewed, served in genuine china rather than tin cups. The biscuits were fresh, the milk real rather than powdered. Every detail contradicted expectations of deliberate humiliation or deprivation. Captain Ashford sat across from Weber and began conversation in excellent German. The questions came naturally, embedded in civilized discourse rather than aggressive interrogation. How was the food in camp? Were the medical facilities adequate? Did Weber have family in Germany? What was morale like in his unit during the final weeks? The approach was devastatingly effective. Weber found himself answering honestly, providing information about German defensive positions, unit strength, and civilian morale that he might have withheld under harsh questioning. The respectful treatment created psychological obligation to reciprocate with honesty and cooperation. Other prisoners experienced similar sessions. Captain Ashford's philosophy was simple but profound. Treat prisoners as defeated soldiers rather than subhuman enemies, and they would respond as soldiers rather than desperate animals. The tea ceremony became symbolic of this broader approach, demonstrating that civilization meant maintaining standards even when dealing with those who had fought for explicitly barbaric regimes. The intelligence gathered through these civilized interrogations proved remarkably valuable. Prisoners provided detailed information about German defensive preparations, troop movements, supply shortages, and civilian morale. The voluntary cooperation achieved through respectful treatment yielded better results than coercive methods employed elsewhere. Weber's transformation accelerated during the following weeks. Daily routine in Camp 174 contradicted every expectation created by Nazi propaganda. Meals were adequate, comparable to British Guard rations. Breakfast typically included porridge, bread, margarine, and tea. Lunch consisted of soup, bread, and occasionally cheese or tinned meat. Dinner featured stew with vegetables and meat, bread, and tea. The portions were sufficient to maintain health and energy for work assignments. Work assignments involved agricultural labor on local farms, hard but fair, with additional rations for manual workers and adequate tools and supervision. British farmers who supervised prisoner work details were instructed to treat them fairly, get honest work from them, but don't abuse them. Weber worked on a farm in Kent for several months, harvesting crops, repairing fences, helping with livestock. The work was demanding for someone who had been a clerk before the war, but not impossible. The British farmer who supervised was stern but fair, showing prisoners how to perform tasks properly, expecting competent work, never raising his hand to anyone. During breaks, the farmer would bring tea and sometimes share cigarettes, treating the prisoners as workers rather than enemies. These work assignments created unexpected interactions between German prisoners and British civilians. Farmers who initially viewed prisoners with hostility often developed grudging respect for men who worked diligently and behaved properly. Some prisoners learned English through daily contact with supervisors. Occasionally, British civilians would share food or cigarettes, gestures that contradicted German propaganda about British hatred for Germans. The agricultural work served Britain's strategic needs during wartime labor shortages. With millions of British men in military service, German POWs provided essential workforce for agriculture and basic construction. The work was regulated under Geneva Convention guidelines: 8-hour days, adequate rest periods, proper tools and safety equipment, additional rations for manual labor, and medical exemptions for those unable to work. Weber found the physical labor challenging but oddly satisfying after months of military service and combat stress. The routine of farm work provided structure and purpose while allowing time for reflection without constant propaganda reinforcement. working alongside British civilians, offered opportunities to observe democratic society functioning normally despite wartime pressures. Medical care provided another powerful contradiction to propaganda. When Weber developed pneumonia during his first winter in captivity, the British medical officer prescribed sulfa drugs, bed rest, and extra rations. A British nurse monitored his recovery, adjusting treatment as needed. Within 2 weeks, Weber had recovered fully. The camp medical facility was staffed by qualified British Army doctors and nurses who treated German patients with the same professional standards applied to British soldiers. Wounded prisoners received surgeries, medications, and rehabilitation. Sick prisoners got proper diagnosis and treatment. Medical care was competent and non-discriminatory. Weber reflected years later, "They saved my life. I would have died from pneumonia without proper medicine. The British gave me antibiotics, professional care, and time to recover. They didn't have to. I was an enemy prisoner, no value to them. But they treated illness as a medical problem requiring medical solution, not as an opportunity to let prisoners die. That professionalism impressed me deeply." The medical statistics documented systematic care. Approximately 80,000 surgical procedures performed on prisoners between 1944 and 1946. Mortality from disease less than 0.3%. Lower than civilian population due to camp sanitation and medical access. Medications provided included antibiotics, pain relief, anti-malarials, and vitamins. This medical care served British interests by keeping prisoners healthy and productive, but it also demonstrated that Britain valued human life even when that life belonged to enemy soldiers. The contrast with Nazi treatment of prisoners, where medical care was deliberately withheld or inadequate, reinforced Weber's growing understanding of civilizational differences. December 1944 brought an incident that crystallized British approach to German prisoners. Camp authorities permitted prisoners to organize Christmas services, both Protestant and Catholic. German prisoners decorated a barracks with improvised ornaments, gathered for religious observance, and sang traditional hymns on Christmas Eve. Weber participated in the Protestant service, joining voices with fellow prisoners as they sang Stille Nacht in German. The song drifted across the camp in the cold winter air. British guards standing watch outside stopped and listened in silence. When the song ended, several guards quietly applauded. One sergeant entered the barracks afterward and distributed cigarettes and biscuits, not required by regulations, but a gesture of common humanity during holidays. Weber remembered the moment vividly. "We were singing about peace and hope while imprisoned by enemies we had tried to kill. The British guards could have mocked us or forbidden the service. Instead, they respected it. When that sergeant came in with cigarettes saying 'Happy Christmas, lads,' I understood something fundamental had changed. These weren't the barbarians we had been taught to expect. They were civilized men treating defeated enemies with dignity we hadn't shown anyone during the war." The Christmas service became emblematic of British camp policy: maintain security and discipline, but recognize prisoners' humanity within those constraints. It was neither cruel nor soft, simply decent. This approach reflected Captain Ashford's philosophy that Britain was fighting to defend civilization against Nazi barbarism. If they abandoned civilized standards in treating prisoners, they would lose what they were fighting to preserve. Religious observance was permitted for all faiths represented among prisoners. Protestant and Catholic services were conducted regularly, with prisoners organizing their own worship under British supervision. Jewish prisoners, though few in number, were also accommodated. The British approach recognized that religious faith provided psychological support, essential for maintaining prisoner morale and cooperation. German prisoners were allowed to write letters home, creating opportunities for propaganda collapse to spread beyond camps. The letters described adequate food, fair treatment, and humane conditions, contradicting Nazi broadcasts about Allied brutality toward prisoners. When families in Germany received letters saying their captured relatives were healthy and treated correctly, it undermined remaining faith in Nazi pronouncements. Weber's letter to his wife in December 1944 stated, "I am well and healthy. The British treat us fairly. We work, we eat, we are not abused. Everything we were told about British cruelty was propaganda. I am safer here than I would be continuing to fight. Do not believe what you hear from Berlin about POW treatment." His wife, living in bombed Hamburg, shared the letter with neighbors. The information rippled through her community. If Nazi propaganda about POW treatment was false, What else were lies? The atomic weapons? The promises of miracle victories? The justifications for continuing hopeless war? British authorities understood these letters' strategic value. Allowing prisoners to write home served multiple purposes. Intelligence gathering, as censors learned about German morale and conditions. Psychological warfare, as letters undermined Nazi propaganda among German civilians. And humanitarian obligations under Geneva Conventions. The censorship process was systematic but not vindictive. Letters were reviewed for military information that might compromise Allied operations, but personal communications about treatment, health, and general conditions were permitted. This policy demonstrated British confidence in their treatment standards while serving strategic communication objectives. Extended captivity in British camps created ideological transformations among many German prisoners who compared their treatment with Nazi principles. The transformation process was gradual. Initial shock at humane treatment gave way to grudging acceptance that British weren't the monsters propaganda depicted. This opened questions about everything else they had been told. Weber described his evolution. I had time to think without constant propaganda reinforcement. I saw British treating us fairly despite having every reason to hate us. I talked to other prisoners who admitted Nazi ideology was bankrupt. I read British newspapers, heavily censored but still providing information we'd never received in Germany. Slowly, painfully, I rebuilt my understanding. I had fought for evil. I had believed lies. The British who defeated and imprisoned me were more honorable than the regime I had served. The transformation wasn't universal. Some prisoners maintained Nazi beliefs despite contradictory evidence. Others experienced partial awakening, questioning some aspects of Nazi ideology while retaining others. But significant numbers underwent complete ideological conversion, recognizing that they had fought for an evil cause against civilized opponents. British authorities recognized this transformation potential and eventually implemented formal re-education programs, though many prisoners had already abandoned Nazi beliefs simply through experiencing British fairness, contrasted with Nazi brutality. The re-education efforts included lectures on democratic principles, discussions of Nazi crimes, and exposure to uncensored information about the war's progress. The voluntary retention program demonstrated the success of British POW policy most clearly. When German prisoners began repatriation in 1946-47, thousands volunteered to remain in Britain temporarily to continue agricultural work. The British government, facing continued labor shortages, permitted prisoner volunteers to stay as civilian workers. Approximately 25,000 German former POWs remained in Britain through 1948, working on farms and in reconstruction projects while living in civilian housing. These men transitioned from enemy prisoners to voluntary workers, contributing to British economic recovery while building new lives far from war-devastated Germany. Weber was among them. He had nothing to return to. His city was rubble, his family scattered or dead. Britain offered work, housing, and the possibility of rebuilding life. Many former prisoners stayed voluntarily. They had been treated fairly as prisoners. Perhaps they could build futures as workers. This voluntary retention demonstrated that decent treatment created cooperation. Men who had fought against Britain chose to remain and contribute to British recovery. The transformation from enemy prisoners to voluntary workers validated the theory that civilized treatment produced better results than brutality. Weber eventually married a local woman, started a family, and became an integral part of his community. The experiences of his captivity and the unexpected kindness of his former enemies had reshaped his worldview completely. He worked in agriculture for several years before transitioning to civilian employment, eventually becoming a British citizen. The restrained, fair treatment of German prisoners reflected and reinforced British self-conception about national character and civilized values. Britain saw itself as a bastion of civilization against barbarism. Maintaining civilized standards in POW treatment, even when dealing with enemies who had fought for an explicitly barbaric regime, confirmed this self-image. British fairness to German prisoners demonstrated moral superiority more effectively than cruelty would have. This wasn't naive idealism. It was a calculating demonstration of civilization's strength. By treating prisoners properly while Germans treated Allied prisoners and everyone else brutally, Britain proved which side represented civilization and which represented barbarism. The contrast with Nazi treatment of prisoners was absolute and intentional. German POW camps for Allied prisoners featured systematic abuse, inadequate food, poor medical care, and deliberate violations of Geneva Conventions. Soviet prisoners faced even worse treatment, with millions dying from starvation, disease, and execution. The Nazi regime's treatment of prisoners reflected its fundamental disregard for human dignity and international law. British treatment of German POWs represented strategic victory beyond military defeat of Nazi Germany. Britain demonstrated that civilization could maintain moral standards under war's pressures, that democratic society could fight total war without abandoning civilized values, that victors could treat defeated enemies with dignity. These weren't weaknesses, they were strengths. For German prisoners who experienced this firsthand, the lesson was undeniable. Britain had defeated them militarily and defeated them morally, by showing that civilization meant more than Nazi propaganda had ever understood. The quiet decency of British POW camps, where German prisoners received tea and fair treatment, where guards maintained order through discipline rather than terror, where enemies were treated as defeated soldiers rather than subhuman criminals, became testament to civilization's resilience. Decades later, in a 1995 interview, Weber reflected on his journey. The British could have treated us brutally. We had fought against them, killed their soldiers, supported a regime that committed atrocities. They had every moral justification for revenge. Instead, they treated us with firm fairness that taught me more about civilization than 12 years of Nazi education ever did. That restraint, that adherence to standards even when dealing with enemies, that was real strength. I learned what democracy and civilization actually mean, not from books but from being imprisoned by people who practice those values, even toward men who had fought against them. The tea ceremony that began Weber's transformation represented more than British politeness. It embodied a philosophy that real strength includes restraint, that victory doesn't require vengeance, and that treating enemies with dignity when you have defeated them shows greater civilization than any brutality could prove. For thousands of German prisoners who expected brutality but received fairness, who anticipated starvation but received adequate food, who feared torture but experienced professional treatment, the British camps became their first real encounter with functioning civilization. The successful management of 400,000 enemy prisoners with minimal mortality, and eventual transformation of many into voluntary workers and democracy advocates, proved that civilized values weren't weakness, but foundation of lasting victory. Captain Ashford's simple gesture of serving tea to enemy prisoners demonstrated that maintaining civilized standards, even toward those who had fought for evil, proved civilization's strength more clearly than any propaganda could. The gray English mornings when German prisoners received adequate food and fair treatment demonstrated truth more powerful than any ideology, that civilized nations could maintain civilized values even in total war against explicitly evil regimes. Weber's story stands as testament to the enduring power of human decency, even in war's darkest moments, and the profound impact of treating one's enemies with dignity rather than hatred. The transformation of enemy soldiers into willing participants in democratic society, through consistent application of civilized principles, remains one of the most remarkable achievements of British wartime administration. If you found this remarkable story of wartime humanity as compelling as we did, please hit that like button. It truly helps us share these incredible historical accounts with more people who appreciate the untold stories of World War II. Make sure to subscribe to our channel and ring that notification bell so you never miss our deep dives into the fascinating, often overlooked moments that shaped our world. We're constantly uncovering these hidden gems of history that deserve to be remembered. We'd love to hear from you in the comments below. Have you heard similar stories of unexpected kindness during wartime? Do you have family stories from this era that contradict what we typically think we know about war? What other aspects of prisoner treatment or wartime conduct would you like us to explore next? Your suggestions and personal stories often inspire our upcoming videos. Thank you for watching and helping us keep these important stories alive. We'll see you in the next one, where we'll continue exploring the human side of history that textbooks often miss.